The Last of Us has been universally considered one of the best games of the generation, maybe of all times. Praised from everything, from its narrative experience to gameplay, characterization, visuals, musical themes, and one of the best, most ambiguous, satisfactory endings of all times. Because of that, naturally, The Last of Us Part 2 could have been one of the most anticipated game ever. And according to Naughty Dog's promises, it was supposed to surpass the first game in every possible way. In this video, I want to respectfully discuss why, in my opinion, it actually did not. It never achieved that. I want to discuss how Naughty Dog made promises it never kept, how it crossed some lines I don't feel like it should have crossed, and how it did not become what it was trying to. This is a video essay and I want to discuss all of that as in-depth as possible. I want to talk about the game controversies, misleading advertisements, diversity, main character's death, new protagonists, narrative decisions, moral scenario the game presented, use of violence, motivations of characters, to name just a few. All cinematic sequences used in this video are provided thanks to the courtesy of the Words of Gaming YouTube channel. There are controversial themes coming, visually sensitive images, as well as The Last of Us Part 2 spoilers. And no, I am not pissed off that I am recording this for the second time, because when I was recording this for the first time, camera did not actually record it. The Last of Us was a story of redemption and self-salvation that received international acclaim, leading to entering early development of a sequel soon after the first game was out. Following the release of Uncharted 4 in May 2016, The Last of Us 2 went into full production with Neil Druckmann returning as its creative director. It was officially announced in December 2016 during PlayStation Experience. Set 5 years after the events of the main game, both Troy Baker and Ashley Johnson were confirmed to be reprising their roles for the sequel, only this time Ellie would be the game's protagonist. Naughty Dog also chose to go with a Part 2 title instead of a numeric sequel, because it was supposed to be a standalone story. And from the very beginning it was also said that while the first game focused on love, the second one would focus on hate. Second trailer was shown at Paris Games Week in 2017. Extended gameplay trailer was presented during Sony's E3 2018, introducing players to Dina, new character and a love interest for Ellie, which at the time caused certain controversies, but not nearly as major as the ones the game itself would cause 2 years later. Fourth trailer was shown during Sony's September State of Play livestream, finally announcing the game's release date, 20th February 2020. Eventually that release date got pushed to May 29th, then even further to 19th of June, since, as we're told, Neil Druckmann wanted to deliver a product worthy of Naughty Dog's standards. Review embargo for The Last of Us Part 2 was lifted on Friday the 12th, 1 week before the game's June 19th release. According to Metacritic and initial reviews, Naughty Dog's product seemed to be a critical miracle, reaching a 96 out of 100 score at the time, earning countless praises from reviewers, calling it not only the best game of the generation, but possibly even the greatest game of all times. A masterpiece, they called it. Was it though? As soon as the embargo was lifted and the first players laid their hands on the game, The Last of Us 2 faced what's universally called a bomb review, tactic used by gaming communities to express collective frustration with publishers. By June 22nd, only 3 days later, the game had received over 38,000 negative user reviews on Metacritic against 22,000 positive reviews and 2,000 mixed. At the time it was fairly certain that people leaving negative feedback did not even finish the game, because its main story lasts 24 hours, 9 hours more than the original installment and 39 hours if you're a completionist. However, months later gamers' reviews are still mixed at best, contrary to critic ones. The Last of Us 2 became the most rated game of all time, and one of the most controversially rated as well. In spite of mixed reviews, it has sold over 4 million copies in the first week. In tens of thousands of reviews, fans pointed out the game's story was filled with plot holes. Characters lacked or betrayed their own motivations, and Naughty Dog presented close to fetishistic obsession with misery and violence. Fans also claimed the game wasn't what the developers strongly suggested it would be. One thing was certain, it did focus on hate instead of love, just like they said it would. From killing dogs and individually named NPCs to watching beloved characters die in a brutal, inhumane way, every possible angle was exploited to shock players. Themes Naughty Dog decided to focus on, so depression, post-traumatic, revenge, hatred, are complicated ones for anyone to present. And there is a fine line between delivering a complex melancholy and meaningless misery. According to many, that line was crossed. Even though the story did in fact focus on revenge, Ellie's path after losing Joe and what seemed to be a post-traumatic syndrome, some pointed out that Naughty Dog previously misled fans. Pushing aside how one feels about the game's story and characters, its presentation in the trailers was very different from what fans actually got. This has led many to discuss whether misleading trailers are okay or not.
You think I'd let you do this on your own?
This line caused major excitement as the game strongly made us believe Joe would not only return but also accompany Ellie on her adventure. Turns out it was actually not the case at all.
I think I'd let you do this on your own.
Jesse.
In the game, Jesse is the one that shows up, grabs Ellie and covers her mouth. Naughty Dog used Joe to build hype for the game and get people excited, only to kill him off early. On top of that, in a frustrating, aggressive way. Fans were shown a game in which they would be able to play with Joe and Ellie again. And then we were given the exact opposite. Now, it's not actually uncommon to mislead fans. Present trailers in a certain way, just to avoid spoilers. And in case of The Last of Us Part 2, the biggest secret was always the fact we'd spent over 12 hours playing as Abby, new character that was never part of the original game. Their need to hide it, even with major leaks that occurred just months prior to game's release, led as fans presenting a very strict embargo which forbade the reviewers from even mentioning second part of the game, one that caused the most controversies. At one point, Neil Druckmann actually confirmed that Ellie was the one playable character in The Last of Us Part 2, which we now know was a lie. Some agree studio had the right to protect the story at all costs. Others state that these actions were uncalled for and constituted false advertising. One should wonder whether, in case of mentioned trailers, a certain ethical line was perhaps crossed. It's one thing to edit a misleading trailer, and it's another thing to purposefully replace a character. But not only that led to fans' outrage. When certain cutscenes from the game leaked in April, the reaction from right-wing players was loud. Much of the hatred was directed at new characters, Abby and Lev. Abby was the game's half-antagonist who, due to her appearance, was misidentified as trans. There is a group of gamers criticizing The Last of Us Part 2 over its diverse group of characters and emphasis on LGBTQ characters. There are some who think that The Last of Us Part 2 focuses too much on Ellie and Dina's relationship, a character named Lev who struggles with his gender identity, and the game's racially diverse cast. Upon such discussions, people tend to use the term forced representation, as nowadays many previously culturally avoided minority groups gain importance, not only in games, but also in books, movies, TV shows. There's a good reason for that. Mentioned groups faced hundreds of years of discrimination, both personally and professionally, one that is sometimes, perhaps, quite difficult to understand by those who never actually encountered it. Just to give you a few examples. Oscar's first ever black winner, Hattie McDaniel, accepted her honor in a segregated no blacks hotel in LA. White actors played colored roles for years, as it wasn't accepted for any actor of color to take the lead. But I think end of the day it doesn't really cost the player anything to view mentioned characters in any work of art, at the price of misrepresented minorities getting their voice and having their lives change as viewers, players, readers come to terms with a simple yet often overlooked fact. that these groups do actually exist. They always have. Ellie's sexuality shouldn't really come as a surprise to anyone, really. Acclaimed The Last of Us DLC Left Behind presented a story of Ellie's first love, girl named Riley, one she lost due to the virus. As Matthew stated in his article called The Last of Us Part 2, Why Some Players Hate the Sequel, if you don't feel that games should champion diversity, not only to help more people see themselves in their escapes from an often hard world, but to amplify the voices of a greater range of creators so we can all benefit from new ideas and new perspectives, then we don't have the words that will convince you that you have nothing to gain from carrying that hate with you. However, having said that, such diversity needs to be properly balanced. It's important to point out at this occasion that there are only 2 sex scenes presented in The Last of Us Part 2. One appears gruff, crude, dirty and offensive, while the other appears sweet, innocent, loving and fairy tale-like. Heterosexual sex was depicted horribly. There's not many players out there who actually enjoyed Abby and Owen's encounter, while the same sex is depicted as close to ideal. Now there could be a good reason behind it, to visually tell us that what Owen and Abby did was ultimately betraying Mel. But there's another double standard here. While Abby and Owen's scene was presented in full, Ellie and Dina's encounter was cut right before anything could be shown. They were even presented almost fully clothed right after, which logically speaking did not make much sense and was not believable. Perhaps Naughty Dog did not want to stand guilty of so-called queer baiting, which in this particular situation would be presenting lesbian sex that often appeals to some players. But there's another side to this criticism too. Many fans who did not quite enjoy the game as much and expressed themselves loudly were often told that they aren't open-minded enough. Some were even called homophobic or transphobic, simply for disliking a game that included LGBT characters. I think it's crucial to state that you can dislike the game or even like it but not as much as some people without having a single issue with diversity it presented, while being open-minded. Now if you know me, you know that I'm the most open-minded person there is. So even though I have certain problems with the game itself, there were certainly not problems that included diversity. Diversity, in my opinion, is not one of the problems this game faced. There's yet another angle to it. Even though Naughty Dog decided to include a queer woman lead in its game, she still acts just as violent as legions of straight male protagonists so well known from thousands of video games prior to this one. There's something that to me doesn't feel quite right here. I think it's a missed opportunity to explore how a marginalized character would approach certain problems with a wider sensitivity rather than focusing on a straightforward violence. Another controversy that this game clearly faced was Joel dying at all. I feel like it's a very personal take on each player's side. Whether you agreed with that narrative decision or not, many actually anticipated it. Naughty Dog clearly wanted to cut that plot and move forward, deciding to deliver us something they'd consider new and bold. And while Joel dying is not the biggest issue the game faced, here's my take on it. I do think he died too early on in the game, and leaving him alive for the majority of it so we'd be actually able to develop some sort of a connection to Abby prior her killing Joel might have been a better narrative decision. Imagine Abby actually sparing Joel because he saved her life. To some, that would have made Abby more likable, and it would teach us a lesson of forgiveness instead of a lesson of never-ending circles of violence. Killing Joel prematurely also led to the game becoming a strictly Abby versus Ellie antagonistic struggle, which some grew to enjoy, and some did not. Spending more time in Jackson to begin with, perhaps at cost of cutting Abby's part of the game shorter for the sake of giving still alive Joel more screen time, even if only to honor his character, could have been a good idea. Another major issue I had was actually the way Joel died. While I don't have a strict problem with portrayal of violence overall, it's not exactly a new concept in the games. I feel like the way Abby killed Joel, brutality and violence of it, the fact that his daughter was forced to watch resembled torture, and storytelling wise, that was unnecessarily crossed line. That's also a criticism towards the game's narrative and faults in Naughty Dog's logic. The way Abby performed mentioned act was not nearly adequate to what Joel did to her father, which, canonically speaking, was killing him through a single cut. Which leads me to another, possibly most controversial matter of the game. New protagonist, Abby, Naughty Dog's well-kept secret. Some people clearly did not like Abby simply because she's a female lead, perhaps too muscular for general taste. Some opted for a straightforward she killed Joel, so I must hate her path. Some considered her a poorly written character. Some fell in love with her, and some remained mostly indifferent towards her, treating her as a side character at best, a character difficult to emphasize with. And I think personally I'm part of that group. Admittedly, I do feel like she was part of the sequel's problem, and that's not even her personally, but the fact that she existed, the fact that she became half of the game, and an important one too. A game that should have been, as we were told, if not Joel's, then Ellie's. First half of the story, times we spent with Jackson, with Dina and Jesse around, at times felt like the first game. It felt spot on. Putting Joel's death aside, I didn't mind having Joel replaced as our co-protagonist by either one of them. Some of the game's most beautiful, poetic moments happened in that very first part. Like Ellie playing Take On Me by a-ha. These small poetic moments allowed us to drift away from violent world, if only for a brief second, and I wish there'd be more of them. In fact, trailers did suggest there'd be more of them. Some trailers presented Ellie playing her guitar and singing, but that never made it into the actual game. Now, in the opposite story, characters presented in Abby's part mostly felt flat, never quite as complex as the first game's heroes like Tess or Bill, never as likable as Dina or Jesse, which again, might just be my personal take on it. However, since you're forced to spend more than 12 hours of game playing as Abby, protecting her, making sure she survives, there's bound to be some sort of loyalty there.
There's enough here that you have to feel some sort of obligation to me.
Second part of the game that we spent with Abby lacked poetic moments first part provided. Nevertheless, it did introduce new gameplay techniques, very challenging enemies which can only be described as highly entertaining and well made, which we'll discuss later. Now, it's clear that making us play first part of the game as Ellie and second part of the game as Abby was Naughty Dog's way of trying to show us that there are two perspectives to each story, that each person has their own motivations, their own priorities. However, what they clearly tried to reach, a moral dilemma that would ultimately come with Ellie and Abby's final encounters, final battles, in my case, never quite worked. Since I never developed a strong bond towards Abby, my loyalty remained with Ellie, however ruthless and detached she felt at the time, which we will discuss. At this point of the game, I barely felt anything rather than maybe a mild frustration, because it seemed like we were going in circles of hatred, and our protagonist frustratingly did not seem to learn at all, or they did learn, but not quite as fast as us, the players. Playing as Abby sort of felt like a long side quest, maybe like a DLC. And while it certainly delivered impressive areas, innovative ways of fighting and challenging enemies, including exciting boss fights, I still felt like I was forced to play as a random NPC's daughter that did not exist in creator's mind at the time of the first part, and not a character that felt essential to the Last of Us universe, like Joe, Ellie, or even Tommy did. As much as I appreciate Naughty Dog's effort and respect some players' bond towards Abby, I just never quite managed to buy into this. Naughty Dog went out of their way to make us sympathize with Abby, including introducing a complicated love interest, seemingly noble father, and circumstances that presented her favorably. Good example is one of the game's riskiest gameplay decisions, making us, the player, kill dogs. That only ever took place within Ellie's questline. Abby not only did not have to kill any dogs nor animals, she even owned the dog that Ellie killed. Abby's father, Jerry, was also portrayed and almost romanticized by Naughty Dog as a person who is sensitive enough to save zebras, which was without a doubt deployed as a plot device, and a person whose only goal is to save mankind. Apparently, as one of my patrons then stated, he was somehow not only a brilliant immunologist, but also did neurosurgery rotation at one point. That simply did not make sense. Neither did the fact that they'd seemingly produce a vaccine based on one brain sample. But that's a scientific take. I'd rather not discuss since I feel like that goes well beyond my knowledge limits. The fact that Naughty Dog had to reach out to plot devices created solely to make us sympathize with Abby means they understood very well our initial priorities lied with Joe and Ellie. It takes a lot of storytelling to make us, the players, sympathize with someone who brutally killed Joe, who entered an open conflict with Ellie. There's a simple truth to it. We are humans, we have our priorities, our loyalties. It's a lesson they've been trying to teach us. To Abby it was her father, to Ellie it was Joel. To me, all throughout the game, however disfigured, it was still Ellie. Because that lesson also applied to me, the player, who played the first game and connected to the protagonists for both the good and the bad times. Abby's father, Jerry, decided to take out Ellie's brain sample in order to try and create a vaccine. An action praised by many. How could you possibly disapprove of that since he had good intentions? What people seem to not give enough attention to though is the fact that by performing mentioned surgery on Ellie, Jerry would be effectively killing a young healthy girl who never specifically agreed to it, contrary to what the game seemed to insist on, with what seemed to be only appearances of true regret. Let's not forget the most important thing that people also seem to oversee. Jerry is a doctor, person of medicine, person of science, a doctor who swore the Hippocratic Oath to first do no harm, which essentially obliges doctors to practice two things only: either help or do not harm the patient.
This awesome responsibility must be faced with great humbleness and awareness of my own frailty.
Above all, I must not play at God.
That oath is the earliest expression of medical ethics in the Western world, establishing several principles which remain of paramount significance today, surely even in a post-apocalyptic world. It was clear that developers took an effort to make us like both Abby and Jerry. My particular issue here, and again, this goes beyond the criticism of the game as a whole, but rather Naughty Dog's overall narration, logic gaps, and attempts to change what the first game told us, lies very much with Jerry himself, person responsible for Ellie's potential death. Now here's my take on it, and it's important to point out that each player is surely allowed to have their own opinion, as we're tiptoeing here around moral, philosophical grounds. Nothing justifies killing a person. Even your best intentions of developing a vaccine, especially not by a doctor whose sole professional purpose is to save people. There's an interesting Doctors React to The Last of Us Part 2 video on YouTube which is worth watching, and actually a doctor pointed out.
They want to kill the child versus trying to save millions of people because of one death. But one death's too many when it comes to that. I would not kill an individual to develop a vaccine. There are other options, there are other ways to go about it. You can get tissue samples, blood, plasma, all different ways without sacrificing somebody's life.
Now, I wouldn't dare to pretend that I know how to solve that moral dilemma that's been around for years. Do you sacrifice one for greater good? Except personally, I don't think we'd be sacrificing Ellie for the greater good. And I don't think that she or anyone for that matter should be sacrificed at all, whether a young person or an older person. As the doctrine of double effect stated, committing an evil act to reach good outcome is still very much evil. Very same thing was later on repeated by Immanuel Kant in his categorical imperative rule. We can determine right and wrong by asking if we would want to universalize an act. Even if killing one innocent saves more people, it is not morally permissible since the act of killing is immoral in all cases, Immanuel Kant said. What I am ultimately saying here is that Joel had every right to bust Ellie out of that hospital. Did he have the right to kill the doctors? No, he did not. I am not saying that Joel is a saint here. I am saying he's a human who in that particular situation did what he had to do to save a person that he loved. One can see where he was coming from. Did Abby have a right to kill Joel in what can only be called the Hammurabian Act? Of course she did not. The struggle to make us sympathize with Abby's part of the story went as far as changing the narration presented in the first game. A character that stood out and actually worked in terms of making Abby more likable was Lev. His story was interesting and contrary to some opinions, his plotline did not feel forced. However, his story strictly tied with Abby's one introduced certain illogicalities one cannot simply dismiss. Not too long after meeting Lev, it became clear that Abby's quest is mirroring Joel's story from the first game. Not only did Abby's fighting style resemble Joel's, her use of physical strength rather than stealth, her lack of shivs, but her surroundings felt more like the ones we knew from the first game too, and more importantly, she also decided to take care of Lev no matter the cost, ultimately effectively killing her own people. Again, Joel did the very same thing while protecting Ellie, or did he not? Joel faced a situation in which his adoptive daughter was forcefully taken from him, sedated, and destined to be killed. Without his approval, without his initial knowledge, and to my best knowledge without moral grounds. Even if initially the Fireflies weren't aware of Joel and Ellie's bonds that came to exist while their journey, Marlene surely realized upon Joel waking up and demanding to see Ellie. Now many players claimed Ellie wanted to be sacrificed, yet they overlooked that she in fact did not. She had plans for the future, learning how to play a guitar, learning how to swim, traveling wherever their companion would go. Does a person being aware that this is a no way back road make plans like these? Also, it is crucial to note a girl that young is not developed enough to make decisions that important, and in the pre-apocalyptic world, her legal guardian would be the one responsible for making such decisions. Now, since Marlene without a doubt gave that function up, Joel would be her proxy. And let's not forget here that killing a person is an irreversible act, and Joel had every right to fight, to react, before it was too late. Especially given how Joel's information was limited to what Marlene told him, that Ellie's a dead man walking. Again, my intention here is not to idealize Joel, nor his prior life before meeting Ellie, since surely at one point he was leading a brutal life. But here in this hospital, his only fault was killing a doctor who was about to kill his daughter, which, again, canonically speaking, happened for a single cut. It's entirely possible to enter that hospital and make your way to Ellie using stealth only, which results in almost no deaths on Joel's part. That's where cutscenes combined with gameplay decisions don't always make sense. It's quite apparent that most of the time we're supposed to care about a single death presented in the cutscene. Yet in the meantime, in the gameplay, we are killing dozens of people, without not so much as a doubt on our protagonist's side. You can sneak your way through the game, or you can kill dozens of people in a brutal way without any influence on the story whatsoever. In The Last of Us ending, it actually doesn't matter if you don't kill anyone in St. Mary's Hospital other than the two people gameplay actually forces you to kill, so Ethan and Jerry. Canonically speaking, it was a slaughterhouse. Now, what Naughty Dog did in the second part of The Last of Us almost felt like idealizing Fireflies' agenda to make Joel's actions seem worse than they in fact were, for the sake of making Abby likable. It's easy to notice that if you watch Marlene's discussion with Jerry in the second game, during which she suddenly seemed very reluctant to kill Ellie.
How many Fireflies have died for less?
That was their choice.
And Marlene's discussion with Joel in the first game, which surely happened only a few minutes later, when she was suddenly almost determined to have Ellie killed.
There is no other choice here.
Yeah, you keep telling yourself that bullshit.
A girl who she promised to protect to her dead mother. The contradiction here is so plain there's no way to explain it rationally within the range of human behavior. If you've never actually played The Last of Us, and only ever played The Last of Us 2, you'd get a misleading concept of what Marlene was. Fireflies were conveniently presented as an organization that was eager to save the mankind and had a background structure to do so. Even the hospital suddenly seemed sterile and clean. Fireflies were no longer presented as a terroristic group. Naughty Dog changed the narration to fit what their goal was, emphasizing the fact that what Joel did was wrong, so we should wonder whether perhaps what Abby did was right. On a side note, one has to wonder, were the Fireflies really trying to save the mankind by creating a vaccine? Or would they use it for their own purposes? Would they actually share the vaccine with other groups, hunters, seraphites, cannibals, or even Jackson citizens? Now I'm gonna bet that no, they wouldn't. Abby was protecting Lev just like Joel was protecting Ellie, the game seemed to be telling us. Except, maybe contrary to countless hours of gameplay that we spent with Abby and Lev, she only knew him for 2 days. Yet after those 2 days, she decided to kill people who were her friends, her family, for at least a couple of years, just to protect a person she knew for hours. While I guess the spontaneity of the situation could have justified it, I'm still leaning towards the opinion that it was yet another narrative decision that didn't quite make much sense, and it's hard to reasonably explain that behavior.
You killed those wolves. It doesn't matter.
She said. To add to it, she clearly stated that she's willing to do anything for the people that saved her life. Except that only appeared to be true when it comes to Lev. And not Joel, who also saved her life. That's just one more plot hole and illogical action that our protagonists performed while betraying their own motivations. Both Joel and Tommy were always known to trust very few people. Yet they introduced themselves by their full names to a group of strangers, a group whose motives were unclear to them. Abby never seems to specifically tell Ellie that Joel killed her father. She really never does that. So in this loophole of revenge, we're supposed to assume protagonists have the player's knowledge. When Abby let Ellie live for the first time, an action praised by many, not only did she not know that Ellie killed her friends, she also thought she already found the person responsible for the death, Tommy. When Abby is ready to kill pregnant Dina, she doesn't even know that Ellie or Dina were anything but Tommy's backup and did anything other than fight her. Speaking of Tommy, Ellie specifically said that she's willing to do anything that it takes to find him and to help him, to save him, just to claim he'll be fine. Hours later, Tommy's final action, expecting of Ellie to leave her partner and her child, only to seek out revenge on his behalf, also felt out of character. Tommy would not have done that, if only due to loyalty he still surely felt towards Joel. Joel would have never expected of Ellie to put herself in such danger, to let hatred consume her. Even if we assume Tommy went through a traumatic event, almost died, and like many in the second installment was blinded by revenge, it still did not feel like Tommy, exposing Ellie to losing everything she has gained, even though she's already lost the single most important person in her life. Throughout this game, all three of the returning main characters from The Last of Us seemed to make choices that felt inconsistent with their characters, but also inconsistent with their own motivations within the game. Which leads me to the final narrative decision that Naughty Dog made, Ellie's actions. A character that we without a doubt loved became someone we did not recognize. She was driven by violence, revenge. She did not seem to reflect upon her own actions, ever. There was a brief moment in the game when it almost felt like Ellie might just live a life that is not centered around viciousness, but just as The Last of Us Part 2 started to be about something bigger, letting go. It was yet again brought back to relentless and suffocating violence. One has to wonder, do the creators really believe that this is how people would behave? That we're all just a catastrophe away from murdering anyone that we encounter? Because this is what Ellie ultimately became, a killing machine. It almost felt like us, the player, was forced to do bad things playing as Ellie, and then specifically told by the game to feel bad about it. Ellie did not feel like the person that we knew. She became something else, something less. And even though in the developer's point of view it was surely justified by loss she encountered, it still felt like some lines were crossed here. Second part, as Neil Druckmann claimed, was supposed to honor Ellie and Joel, yet all three main characters became either mutilated, disfigured, or brutally killed. Ellie should have understood this part of the journey. I kept expecting her to grow and turn away from a life of constant violence, but she never gets the obvious nature of the game she's in. Even as the developers beat you over the head with a very simple lesson about the value of human life. It's very hard for me to not see certain logical gaps, to not see certain characters' betrayals, to not see how they changed the narration and how they were trying to deploy certain plot devices. But I want to also talk about some positive sides. The game is graphically stunning to a level that is unmatched by most of its competition, as is the physical and voice acting. Amount of presented details is truly striking. Stunning. Abby's voice changes anytime she's climbing, as we know she's suffering from fear of heights. Protagonist's clothes get wet anytime it's raining. Your equipment is soaked after you've entered water. Light rays are affected by the trees. Characters react to outside factors. They shed their eyes upon walking towards the sun. Trees are realistically moving, to name just few. Ellie can swing on ropes, climb vertical structures, navigate boats, ride horses, break glass, crawl through grass. She can sprint, dodge attacks, time her counterattacks. She can use enemies as a shield, and she can get help from friends. Characters' bodies were presented faultlessly. Naughty Dog went to great lengths to realistically explain why Abby was able to maintain a muscular body. She had access to daily balanced diet and access to training equipment used by athletes. What caught my attention though is the fact that her body never seemed to change even when all these things that I mentioned were taken away from her since she ran off with Lev. Obviously their caloric intake has been reduced. Abby no longer had any access to equipment, yet her body did not change and neither did Lev's. On the other hand, Dina's body was presented perfectly and consequentially. In the beginning, she's young and fit, while later on, after giving birth, her body takes on the appearance of a woman that has a child and is nursing. Both the overall visual side of the game, stunning cinematic sequences, countless little details, musical score, and most of all voice actors, Troy Baker, Ashley Johnson, and especially Laura Bailey, deserve highest possible acclaims. There's no doubt this game was developed with the highest possible care, on highest possible standard, one that no game has ever reached so far. To me, The Last of Us is and always will be about Joe and Ellie, more than anything else, and we were reminded of it again and again anytime the game explained what happened between the first game and the second one. We visited a museum, saw dinosaurs, took a spaceship together in what was one of the franchise's greatest scenes. We found out that Ellie did eventually learn how to play a guitar, like she was planning to all along. We found out about Ellie falling in love with Dina, how she faced what same-sex relationships often do, how Joel got involved. Finally, we learned how Ellie found out what Joel did, how it disunited them, because she could not forgive him, because she wanted her life to matter. And then we learned how slowly they made their way back to each other, just hours before Joel died. Ellie says she's willing to try.
I don't think I can ever forgive you for that. But I would like to try.
In this very moment, that particular scene, Naughty Dog reached its storytelling brilliance. Ellie confronted Joel. She tells him she was supposed to die in that hospital because that would have made her life matter. Yet Joel's choice to save her stands with pride here. If he had a choice to go back to that moment, he would do it all over again.
If somehow the Lord gave me a second chance at that moment, I would do it all over again.
Even if it meant her turning away from him forever. She looks at him, and she understands that. She knows that. She says,
Yeah. Okay.
Just like by the end of the first part, we made a full circle. We went back to realization that Joe and Ellie's bond is one of the most human relationships ever created in any game. Yet sadly, The Last of Us Part 2 ending does not compare to the original game's final moments. In terms of quality, no depth. Its relatively straightforward nature in comparison to the morally ambiguous conclusion of the previous title is striking. Nuances of the first installment have been gone in favor of telling a story of vengeance and its impact on those who seek it. A story that's been already told before many times. While the first game was a profound experience, the second one presented what the characters did, how they behave. Unlike the first game, the second one did not teach me anything about what it means to be human. That viewing went as far as asking myself whether the developers perhaps considered me, the player, stupid. If they thought the existence of violence, revenge, and seeing things from a different perspective simply never occurred to me before. It felt like they needed to beat me over the head with the lesson that they do exist, which I knew they did. At this point, going back to the very beginning of the review, I couldn't help but ask myself, why are the critical reviews so different from the players' reviews? Is it because reviewers had deadlines to meet? Perhaps they only focused on the gameplay, the visual part of it, which without a doubt was a masterpiece? But the critics have praised the story, its presentation, the dark mature themes. However low, user reviews cannot be simply dismissed and overlooked. And media misrepresented wildly what many people have felt. Did we play different games? Why was there so much disconnection? Can we even trust the reviewers anymore? The game bashed players over the head with its message that violence is wrong, that revenge is not worth it. It focused on loss, hatred, viciousness, almost automatic aggressive reactions to pain. But I cannot help but notice that we are actually so much better than Naughty Dog thinks we are. We don't always settle for plain Hammurabian reactions. There's so much in between that the first game presented perfectly, while the second one decided to settle for simple answers. It left me with a bitter aftertaste. According to Naughty Dog, we do not learn, we do not grow, we act violently, and we don't foresee consequences of our own actions. And most of all, we're gonna have to live with what The Last of Us Part 2 left us with, what it did to our beloved characters. Ellie ended up alone, even though it was the very thing she was afraid of, leaving her guitar behind, losing her fingers, losing Joel dying in a cruel way, Ellie being the very last thing he sees right in front of his eyes, no doubt being aware how this might affect her life, as he's been through this. He has too once lost everything. Dina giving up on Ellie being once again left behind. In this act of Shakespearean tragedy, we weren't left with a shed of life, a shed of hope. And what we're supposed to learn from this dim lesson is that darkness wins. While the first part taught me there's a redemption waiting for anyone, even for those who lost everything and lost themselves in the process and became ruthless. Second one chose a violent path and went against what I thought humans were, deserving a second chance. And while the first game gave something to me, the second one took something away.
No, I can't walk on the path of the right, 'cause I'm wrong.